the show. Today I have with me Evan and Savvy. Savvy short for Savannah, Evan short for Evan, so there you go. Now, Evan is has worked in the software industry for quite a long time. He's originally from New Zealand and comes from a town that has a Maori name, and that's the indigenous people of New Zealand, for those who don't know what a Maori is. Evan worked for NEC apparently as one of their software architects, and then he moved to the States, has been in San Francisco for a long time, 10 plus years, and was one of the founding team of a company called Twilio that started in 2008. They're a software as a service company that connects two global networks, the internet and telecommunications network. He was one of the, I suppose, small team that grew it, and started in 2008, Twilio, and today they have 4,500 employees, and they have a market cap bigger than Ford. So, and I think Evan had quite a bit to do with the success of that company, and now he's moved on to a little company called, well, little maybe in comparison, not sure, we haven't talked about size here yet, but Fin.com, which is another software as a service company. So, welcome to the show, Evan and Savvy. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much. Yes, I should. So the town, if anyone is interested, it's called Paraparaumu. It is a Māori name. I do want to just clarify one thing, because I would feel bad trying to steal additional unwarranted thunder, but I was not a founder or a member of the founding team at Twilio, but I was a very early employee. And you're right, like multiple orders of magnitude of growth through the period that I was there. So I think you mentioned company was started in 2008. I joined or started, really met with the company, I think toward the end of 2010, as the company was raising Series B financing, but still a very small team at that point, and was you could say a founding member of the go-to-market team, the sales team. So within a few days, we basically went from being a relatively fully self-service long-tail product to one where we were actually doing active enterprise sales and putting sales into the motion of taking that product to market. Very, very extraordinary company in all contexts, but certainly in terms of growth over the period of a decade, very, very remarkable.
What fascinates me about companies, especially ones that scale to the size that Twilio has, is they go from just an idea, which is just someone's imagination, to where they've created a company of that scale making such a difference on the planet. In other words, they go from idea to execution, scaling and growth. Do you know the original idea? Where did the idea from Twilio come from? Because you would know the CEO quite well and founder. So do you know where it came from?
Yeah, Jeff had a lot of experience building companies before Twilio, and he'd had several attempts at things. Some had worked, some hadn't. He was part of the founding team of StubHub, which is quite a successful company, but had a string of other ideas that didn't work out quite to that level. But in each of those cases, there was a problem that he was trying to solve, which was he was a software developer. Actually, software development really flows through the DNA of that company still to this day. But early on, it was like everyone and every function had quite a bit of exposure or experience with software development. And I guess he just felt as a software developer that he should be able to build things. And on the web, you can do that. On mobile, you can do that. And in the field of communications, real-time communications, so things like voice, video, but at that time, really, telecommunications, phone systems, and the like. Even as a software developer, you just couldn't really do anything. You couldn't build anything. It was dominated by companies that would install hardware and configure it for you, and so on and so forth. And so his idea really, and it's quite brilliant, was cloud computing was emerging at the time, and AWS was growing very rapidly. And it just seemed possible for the first time ever to say, let's take this relatively closed off network that carries billions of dollars of economic value every year, which is the telecommunications network, and figure out through APIs ways to expose that to the millions of software developers around the world who will be able to do creative things with it. And that was that was really the genesis, I believe, of the company, and that philosophy really stuck with the company for a long time. We did get to a point where we expanded into other types of products that were not strictly involved in telecommunications, but that was enough to keep us busy for a number of years early on.
So what was so the idea you started executing, was he a software coder himself?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
That's an interesting topic. I do a fair amount of early stage investing, or at least if I'm not investing myself, then also advising companies on early stage investing. And I do think there's a lot of people with like great ideas, and there's sort of, I guess, investability thresholds that you go through, and being able to just create something, to be able to create a prototype, whether you're doing it yourself or working with someone that you know very closely, to me is incredibly important. The notion of investing in something pre-revenue is not that scary, but the notion of investing in something pre-revenue and pre-proof of concept is fairly scary, because there's just no strong indication that this entrepreneur, unless they have a really illustrious, or they have a lot of evidence behind them from their history, there's not a lot of evidence that they're actually going to be able to get something to market. And so I think that's super important. So here in Silicon Valley in particular, you find that there's a lot of founding engineers, a lot of people that start companies are engineers. Don't think it's totally necessary, but from an investability perspective, certainly want to see something that works before throwing some money behind it, at least from my perspective. And Savvy, actually, so you mentioned this, Savvy's on the call as well, and you should probably introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about what you do. But Savvy has a very long history of working with companies like the company that I'm CEO of now, Fin, but also other early stage companies in terms of sort of getting them their first marketing motions going and things like that.
Hello, and thank you. I'll take that moment. I'll take that cue for my intro. Hello, everyone. Jeff, thank you so much for having both of us on today. My name is Savannah Peterson, but everyone calls me Savvy, and I run a company called Savvy Millennial, where we make the future less scary by building community around new technology. So I work specifically almost exclusively with Series A high growth startups who are looking to get to their first 1,000 or 10,000 customers and understand what that customer journey is and build community around their team as well as their early stage product. So I get to see a lot of companies like Fin, like Twilio, and like a lot of the startups out there that are really in a high risk situation, and hopefully make that whole experience less risky by helping them with their marketing. So it's a really unique, I feel a little bit like a VC sometimes, because you're having to see the forest through the trees and predict where the future market is going, and it's a wild ride. I'm lucky to be on the roller coaster.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating area, because essentially you're leveraging networks to create community, aren't you? So and social media is part of that. So maybe just touch on community before we get back and hear more about what fin.com is all about, because we need to get to that. But what do you see as important in building a community for an organisation such as fin.com?
To me, community is your first defensible asset. If people are passionate about the solution that you provide, they'll ride with you through pivots and through the ups and downs that every early stage company has. And you do that by being engaging and transparent and authentic about user feedback and keeping really consistent communication with your early customers, both on the positive and the negative, and understanding what that voice of customer is. And I'll see that there's a real clear differentiation for me often, and sometimes unfortunately, when it comes to these early stage companies, is people will get excited about a very consistent consumer traction without understanding exactly why they're winning, which is lovely, but it's likely that you're a cheaper option or maybe the first player in a space. Now, if somebody comes up and builds community around their product and really reinforces why that product adds value to that person and encourages them to share that story, not only are they changing the size of their marketing team, sometimes by 100 or 1,000x, by empowering that community to then go on and be ambassadors and evangelists for the product, they're also really understanding how to make it a repeatable enterprise situation or a self-service SaaS operation, or the type of product company that can sell hundreds of thousands or millions of physical units. So there's so much to learn early on. And I think people get excited about the product moving forward without necessarily understanding why and that true value added and that need solving that happens, like a little design thinking here. And yeah, community is so special. When you talk I'll bring it back to Finn here actually really appropriately. One of the true joys of my work with Finn has been talking to our customers and understanding exactly where they were off at in their business journey and what their pain points were when they found us. And the reality is everyone wants to work as efficiently and as smart as possible so that we can do all the other things in our life that make us feel awesome. And the other reality is every single human being works differently. We all have different processes for how we use Slack or log into Zoom or work in a document. And when we are aware of those processes and we have insights on those processes, we're able to figure out how everyone can work more efficiently and raise the water level together. And that's what we do at Finn, which is very cool. So it's about optimizing top performance and really understanding the details of one's day that can be either tweaked or learned from to make work better for everyone.
Yes, so that's really, really interesting to learn about community. A lot of people say, okay, I've got followers, for example, I've got a business, and we're doing well, but you've never taken the time to survey them. Even when they survey them, you don't know whether they're telling you the truth. They're going to give you the information that they want to tell you. I suppose it's trying to gain real insights into your community and why are they buying your product and why are they remaining loyal. And I think that's the other thing too is, so I think we'll hand it over to Evan to describe what Finn.com does. Finn, I'm going to say what I think it is because I've seen it from a little front end, haven't dived into the back end, excuse me. It's sort of like using humans and AI to identify what works and what doesn't within an organisation, and then to make it more productive. That's my view of the front end. So, but Evan, please explain what it really does.
You're not far off. I mean, we don't necessarily use humans. Our customers are using humans, as most companies are. And what we do is we say that our mission is to help people do their best work. What we really do is instrument knowledge work. So if you look at a modern enterprise, I think you will find tons of instrumentation. You will find people turning everything into data. There's telemetry on hardware. There's telemetry in software. It's kind of telemetry everywhere. And there's a really important piece of the puzzle that is largely unmeasured, which is what are humans actually doing all day? And this is important to understand
for a number of reasons.
Well, it's kind of the thing. And, we're not really focused to a certain extent on what are individual humans doing all day, because I think I agree with you. That's do we really want to know? And maybe there are cases where we do, but maybe there's cases where we don't really care. It's more about where you have a large team of people who are doing something, particularly something on a computer, let's say something in software, and they're doing that thing relatively repeatedly and at relatively large scale.
Yep.
And what Finn will do is actually tell you what the patterns are in that work. So what are the workflows that people are actually following? What does a top performer look like, and how do you train other people to perform like top performers? Where are the technology bottlenecks that are holding people up or causing frustrations or causing problems? And then if you have different teams in different regions or things like that, you could look at the data through that lens and say, okay, well, we should be trusting this team to handle this type of task more, and this other team over here to handle this other type of task more. And the way that we do that is through a sort of revelation that really most enterprise work today happens inside a web browser. And so by actually instrumenting the browser itself, we can understand across all the different applications that someone's using all day, what are the things, the tasks that they're completing, what are the workflows that they're following, and how are they using these different applications to do so, and essentially surface insights from that.
So I think one of the points you made, well, points the website said in the company, was that you improve productivity by up to 20%. I suppose you're trying to remove friction points between how people work, identifying what isn't working. And there's the old saying, management by walking around, right? And whereas you're saying we're going to do management by not walking around, and we're going to use data to work out how we can, and then get insights from that data to identify how you can make the company more productive. And then apply some smarts to it using AI to really give, because there's so much data, making sense of all that noise is our biggest challenge as humans, isn't it? So, and that's what Fin does. Is that sort of thing that Fin does? It's use the AI layered on top of all that data to gain insights to actually make recommendations.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's very spot on. Actually, one of the things you mentioned is this idea of management by walking around. Well, one of the tailwinds I think that we have had as a company in the last year or so is obviously that became very impractical during COVID. But even when you can perform quote unquote management by walking around, it carries with it a lot of bias, and it carries with it a lot of sort of inefficiency and inaccuracy is probably the better way of describing it.
Yep.
There's something called a time and motion study. And that's, I think, what you're referring to, which is when you're really trying to figure out, and this goes way back to the Industrial Revolution, you're trying to figure out what's the best way to assemble a car. You watch the best people do it, and then you kind of make notes of that and figure out what the numbers are and use that to train other people. And what Fin allows you to do is to perform essentially those types of studies, but without sampling. You're actually looking at the entire population. You're looking at the entire data set of all work being done, being performed, and using that to make inferences. So a really good example, I was just talking to a customer before this call actually, and one of the things that they brought up was that there was a customer support team essentially. And one of the things that customer support teams do is they have something called macros, and macros are essentially pre-written text blobs. So, if someone emails in and says, I want to cancel my order, you have a pre-populated blob. And they've been making all these changes to these macros and trying to understand how those changes were being adopted by the workers, and also how often it was that the team would actually go ahead and edit those macros. That was what they set out to find. What they actually found is that no one's using them. Everyone's using Google Docs and has written all their own, templated responses, and is just copying and pasting in these responses from Google Docs into the customer interaction. And so, we were able to quantify that from a numeric perspective and say this is how often it's happening, and they can then take that and say, okay, well, is this a good thing or a bad thing, and how often does it result in a higher NPS or lower NPS? It's Net Promoter Score, essentially a metric of customer happiness. So just sort of being able to get an understanding of, like I say, what it is that folks are actually doing. And I think with the explosion of SaaS, software as a service, it's really changed the way that everyone works and the way that everyone adopts software. And so what it means is now, instead of the CTO or someone sort of dictating, here's the software we're going to use and here's exactly how you perform certain tasks with it, teams in an enterprise will just go and find their own tools, which is great. It's great for entrepreneurs because you can very easily spin up these highly specific SaaS programs. But it makes it harder for an IT department or an enterprise to actually understand what tools are people using, how are they using them, and what work is being done, basically.
Yeah, and also the other thing that must be interesting for you in the current situation with everyone doing remote work and hybrid work, in other words, in the office and out of the office, remote work, is that you're providing a tool that identifies how people are working, no matter where they are, whether in the office or whether they're working from home. Is that correct?
Yeah, and some of the insights from that have been really interesting. So, for example, we also understand like people's Wi-Fi performance and their computer performance, and so we can provide insights like, this particular cohort of workers, they may not be delivering as much as everyone else, but it's not because they're lazy or not trying or whatever it is. It's because they've got slow internet, and so you need, it makes sense for you to go and invest in giving these people better technology to use at home. So again, it's less about being punitive and more about just being objective, just trying to figure out how do we make this better for everyone. And I think for the most part, team members appreciate that. It's everyone, I believe, wants to do their best work whenever it's possible. And so removing any sorts of roadblocks, whether that's bad software or bad networks or bad training or whatever it is, that prevent people from doing their best work, is a good thing to do, I think, objectively.
Yeah, it's sort of what you're doing is more, I suppose, anonymous rather than actually identifying people that aren't, going off and surfing at Bondi that day or something. The other interesting thing, I was talking to an entrepreneur that runs a remote work management platform, and of course his business has exploded as a Canadian entrepreneur, and the AI and the data is helping them identify 6 months before an employee is going to leave. So that's a fascinating insight. And from that then, are there any really fascinating insights you've learned from the data that you guys didn't expect, or the companies that use your software have discovered? Any fascinating insights that have surprised you and the team?
Savvy's been interviewing a lot of our customers recently on stuff like that. She might have some things she wants to mention.
I think sometimes, one of the other things that we do is not just look at individual workers or machines across internal orgs, but we also look at how you interface with your external customers. So one of our core customer profiles is executives who work with remote sales teams for other people. So they are the remote sales team for a lot of folks. And one of the things that we found that's super fascinating from one of our customers go-to is the way that they've transparently almost become competitive with Fin. So they used Fin so well and effectively that they've actually got a staff member that they've hired to full-time edit together the video clips that are captured throughout the day across the course of their team to turn them into teaching tools. So whether that's best practices for empowering your frontline sales team or how to handle a tricky customer issue or whatever that is, they're creating their own content, and they're actually using some of that content for marketing materials, for best practices, for customer experience, or for whatever that is. So you can get caught doing something good. And I think that's one of the things that's really cool about Fin is it's not just, this person is closing Slack too many times. It's also, wow, you really nailed that tricky situation negotiating with a customer who was thinking about churning. Now let's spread that across the rest of the company and teach them how to do that. Or in some cases, this is another fun one from the same customer. They had a customer who had asked the frontline team to copy and paste the company logo into Zendesk every time because he wanted the branding, and Zendesk doesn't support that auto-enabled. And that action was costing the entire customer experience team 20% of their bandwidth. So their efficiency was capped at 80% at maximum if people were going to copy and paste. So they were able to take this simple action out of their email flow and literally get 25% or 20% more time across their entire team. So that's kind of cool. They also will share learning experiences sometimes, so that the CX teams themselves really do want to be better. People want to keep their job and they want to advance. And so they'll catch each other sometimes in the act of doing something good, or share best practices when that CEO notices that there's a pattern across the company. Rather than calling one person out and making it feel like a bad thing, he'll take the opportunity to make a video and teach the team how to be most efficient. So as an example with that recently, the average person, every time they opened Slack, was clicking 31 times, which is a little excessive. So he did a how-to video on how to thread within Slack, and they were able to drop their average click rate, I think, to 11 or something pretty dramatically within just the first 2 weeks. So it's everything from the way we click on a page to the actions we take and the words that we do, but also figuring out how to make work feel more purposeful. And I think that's what we see a lot with the CX side of Finn.
Well, sorry, Jeff. One thing that, this is going to sound a little pessimistic, but one thing that always jumps out at me from these customer interactions is people spend so much money on software, and there's this constant barrage of new software. It's like, oh, you need a new ticketing system, you need to use new CRM, you need this. Now there's outreach tools, and there's all these new classes of tools and whatever. And one thing I hear quite a bit is, and this is actually, I think, a very strong value proposition for Finn, although it doesn't sound like it on the surface, is, we spent a whole bunch of money on software, and then we implemented this new system, and then we benchmarked it against the old one using Finn. And what we found is that it's exactly the same. Like, we hear that like quite a bit. And I know that's a little bit, I don't know, nihilistic or something, but it is really interesting, because I do think like vendors, especially software vendors, are really good at creating this sense of urgency and like, oh, this thing that we just released is actually 10 times better than the last one, and you've got to switch to this, and you've got to start doing it this way. It is actually, it's just strange. We spend so much money on humans in terms of paying humans, and then we spend so much money on software, but we have like very little data on what actually happens when those two things come together. And Finn is essentially presenting that data to business owners for the first time, and I think some of the results are a little surprising to them, just in terms of how the efficiency gains they get from the software is not always exactly what they were promised. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's very interesting hearing Savvy's description of what she's discovered in terms of doing customer interviews, and I think one of the things humans quite often try and avoid is doing the boring things such as documenting processes and best practice. And what I'm hearing a little bit is that part of Finn's value proposition essentially is that part of what you're doing is actually capturing the processes within an organization and almost doing it without having to do it almost without thinking. And I think
100%.
And that's really, really cool, because the challenge I think every organization has is going from the wild west of being an entrepreneur and just making shit happen, is going, okay, now we've got to scale this baby. How do we scale it? And what you need to do is you need to actually capture the processes. So when you onboard new employees, you go, this is how you do it. And it's also, a lot of people don't know what the processes are in an organization. If you're going to go to sell it, people are going to go, well, what's your processes? Is this replicable? Is this scalable? A great example of this is a company called GitHub, which actually has 1,500 employees and has 8,500 pages of documented processes. And I've talked to other entrepreneurs too, and in this remote work environment and hybrid work environment we're going into, is using asynchronous communication, which is recording videos that are one-to-many for the CEO to share what he believes is best practice for selling the product, for example, or communicating. So does that surprise you a little bit about what Finn's value proposition?
I think that was
one of the ideas.
So we didn't really talk about how Finn started, but
yeah,
we should do that a little bit.
Yeah,
but that's a real goal for us. We've come to refer to it as where I refer to it as continuous process discovery, and the idea being that I think in history there was a thought that processes would be defined from the top down. There used to be a role called an enterprise architect, which I think you hear less and less these days, where someone actually defines and documents processes. I think due to, like I was mentioning earlier, the explosion of SaaS software and just the speed at which companies can grow now as well, that oftentimes processes aren't actually really understood. And so being able to continuously capture them and improve them is hugely valuable. And that really is the founding story of Finn to a certain extent. So you mentioned earlier, I was at a company called Twilio for 10 years. And meanwhile, two gentlemen, a guy called Sam Lesson, who was very early product leader at Facebook, and a guy called Andrew Cortina, who co-founded a payments company called Venmo, which is very, very popular here in the US. They started a consumer startup, and it was intended to be an intelligent and AI augmented but human powered digital assistant product. And so they hired hundreds of agents who would sit all day, or not sit for 8 hours a day, whatever it was, in places like Phoenix and other places around the US, and they would perform tasks that had been sorted and filtered for them by AI, but which they were manually completing. So I could ask the assistant, hey, can you book me a flight from San Francisco to New York, and I don't want to have any layovers, et cetera, et cetera. And that task would eventually land on a person's desk, and they would go and fulfill it for me. And I would never know who that person was. I would feel as though I was speaking to an AI. And these two guys coming from big consumer technology companies were very used to instrumentation and being able to see data and understand, okay, where's our profitability, where's our margin, where's our opportunity. And all of a sudden they felt like they had no idea what they were dealing with. What tasks are people performing? What's the best way to perform a certain task? How long does a certain task take? Is a certain task profitable or unprofitable? How do we train people? And so they actually built Fin as a back office tool to help them run this startup. And a few years passed, and it became very clear that perhaps this back office tool was actually a better company. And so that's how I became involved, was through a venture capital firm called Kotu, who then went on to lead an investment that we did very recently. And they basically said, hey, look, we want to turn this into a B2B company. We've got some great customers. And I came over as CEO and then proceeded to recruit essentially a more seasoned B2B centric leadership team, sales leader from LinkedIn, brought in people from companies like Coupa and Slack and Amazon, and just folks who have a bit more B2B behind them. So now we're really ramping up the company and accelerating our growth, selling to companies with a heavy operations component.
So what do you think of the idea started essentially with a completely different concept, and then there's a pivot. This seems to happen a lot. I've heard that sometimes a lot of companies have two pivots before they actually get to what they really should be doing. So how many pivots have you done? Is it just one?
Yeah, just one. And I think it's where do you draw the line? Like, what's a change of strategy and then what's a pivot? I think when you completely change the customer that you're selling to, it's pretty clear that that's a pivot. I'm sure that we will continue to evolve our vision and our perception of our market, and we will iterate and have product line extensions that necessitate audience extensions or vice versa. But we're at the rate at which we're growing, and there seems to be very strong appetite for this product from the market. So I think we have our direction now, let's say. But it is very, very common, and I think it's potentially, there's a big difference between building a consumer technology product and building an enterprise technology product. But I think when you're building enterprise technology products, you really are listening to customers a lot, and I think a lot of entrepreneurs will try to solve a problem that they believe exists, and maybe that comes from their own work history. But once they get out and actually start talking to customers, either realize that there's a higher potential opportunity that's in the adjacent possible, as they say, or that the mission that they are on, whilst it is a problem, is a very hard problem to solve in an economically positive way. Either it's too hard to sell or too hard to sell for enough money to cover essentially the costs of building it. So you see a lot of pivots with early stage B2B companies.
Absolutely. So Steph, I'm going to ask you this question based upon you talking to the customer of Fin.com. And what's the biggest problems that you're solving for them that you've come across?
They know that there's information out there. There's data somewhere that can help their team work more efficiently, and they're not sure how to find it. So the biggest pain point that we hear come up a lot, and this is something that is particularly, well, it's pertinent for all of our companies, but really important for our soon to IPO customers, is the level of granularity that we can provide. Because if you're about to start disclosing a bunch of public financial information, or if you already are, those extra seconds and those extra cents can lead to millions and sometimes billions of dollars in savings or efficiency for a business. So they know that there's all these pieces out there. There's lots of data flying around. They have a bunch of disconnected dashboards that aren't coming to a central place to provide synthesized, actionable information. And they want it. They want to be able to charge less to their customers, or they want to make margin where there isn't any, or they want their teams to be saving hours every week. And they believe that they should be able to surface this, but there isn't one tool to rule them all, for lack of a less horrible Lord of the Rings analogy, that can surface, and you're gonna kill me for that one being a Kiwi, that can surface and display this information in a way that's digestible, not just to that CX manager or that VP of ops, but also for that last C-suite mile. You want to be able to turn to the top or to the board and say, this is what we did this quarter. We improved handle time by this. We made our teams 3 times more efficient. We identified that these tools don't work and this tool makes us 15% more productive, and we managed to increase our margins by 8%. And that's exactly the kind of information that's going to get you promoted, keep your job, and help everyone around you feel more successful.
So in other words, you're surfacing data that tells what really is happening rather than just a hunch. And of course,
there's a certain anxiety that just comes from not knowing. You have this big team. So in some of the teams we work with, it's thousands of people doing the same job, whether it's accounts receivable or accounts payable, processing invoices, whatever it is. There's thousands of people, and as a leader, you're tasked with keeping these people happy and productive and servicing the needs of the organization. It's just very hard to know what's going on, and I think that creates a certain sense of dread for a lot of people. And even sometimes knowing that things aren't working is better than just not knowing anything. That would be, I think that's a huge thing. I think the other one, and Savvy mentioned this, but a lot of these people-centric and operationally centric teams have a very hard time demonstrating a return on investment. So if you're a sales team, it's quite easy to demonstrate your return on investment, the sort of dollars in, dollars out. If you're a support function, or what you might call a staff function within an enterprise, it can be very difficult to demonstrate that, right? If you're a support team or some sort of customer operations type team, it can be very difficult. So being able to even establish a baseline of return on investment is a great win for a lot of customers.
So that sort of begs the question then, what is Fin.com's ideal customer?
Good question. I have a strong opinion on that, but I think right now with the product where it's at, we like operationally heavy companies. So companies like we've had a lot of success with the gig economy type companies, so meal delivery and vacation rentals, and we've also had a lot of success with crypto companies. These are all companies where for every transaction that happens in software, there's a high propensity for that transaction to end up involving a human being at some point. And so they tend to have very large teams of people that are dealing with relatively repetitive work. And so that's kind of, I think those two axes of like how many people are doing the work and how similar is the work, if you score high on both of those, then it's a slam dunk. If you score high on one of those, it's a pretty good fit. And the way that the direction that we're driving the product from a roadmap perspective and investment perspective is that even a small team, and even a team working on very creative, very novel work, should be able to get a lot of value out of it. I for example, as a CEO of an early stage startup, I'd love to know, how I compare against other early stage startup CEOs in terms of like, do I spend disproportionate amounts of time sending and receiving email, or should I be spending more time or less time in customer calls? And so we do have a notion of industry benchmarks for certain scores or for certain types of activities, and I think like that's something that would be super interesting for a lot of people as we continue to evolve the product.
Yeah, that's very
One thing
interesting.
that I would just add there, because I think it's very unique to Finn's customer set, and I've learned this from some of our customers in the financial side, talking about MoneyLion specifically. When if your business model is making money off of something or removing a fee that has existed before, and you're trying to create a seamless or more efficient business process. So in the case of MoneyLion, it's removing banking fees, which we've all been charged a million times, no matter what country you're from in most cases. And if you're going to eliminate those fees, you have to find ways to make money elsewhere. And Finn helped them identify what the opportunities were and do the trade-off analysis on how to build a successful business model that was going to make them money. So it's a discovery tool as well as this insights and optimization tool too.
It's is it a tool that helps you identify where you should be spending your time? In other words, helping you with what your priorities should be. Because I read a great book. I've actually read it twice, called "The One Thing" by Gary Keller, which. And you just mentioned
I've read it as well.
Yeah, and Evan, what you were saying before was, as a CEO, how am I benchmarking against other CEOs in other early stage startups? And am I spending too much time on email? Because we quite often, as entrepreneurs and CEOs, founders, we get up in the morning, we start doing emails, we go down the rabbit hole of emails, and you feel like you're doing work, but in one essence you're going, and you get to the end of doing emails and you sort of feel a little hollow because you're not actually focusing on big priority tasks that are actually going to make a difference. You've just ticked a couple of boxes, and I don't know, that's how I feel. I'm going, so what's the one thing I can do today that I can get done by lunchtime before I run out of energy or have my energy drop? Then I can do the low energy tasks later in the day. But the trouble is we get dragged into this vortex of email answering. So I'd be interested in your thoughts, Evan, on that.
Well, I mean, I think for us as a product, that's aspirational at this point. I mean, to my earlier point, it's definitely more for teams right now, and the larger the team, the more data you're going to get out of it. And so it would be more like, as a team leader, you may say, "Hey, we as a team are spinning our wheels way too much on a certain thing, and so let's just drop that entirely." And sometimes we see customers who will just entirely remove something. They say, "We're just not going to do that anymore. It never results in a good outcome. We spend way too much time on it, and so we're just going to make it self-service or let customers somehow do it themselves." So that's kind of more realistic, I think, to where we are right now and the types of problems we can solve. I think as we evolve the product and especially make it easier for people to onboard, so to become Finn customers and set up the system in such a way where it understands their daily workload. Yeah, I'd love to see it be useful for very small teams and even individuals at that point. On the other topic, though, I mean, I don't know if anyone has a solution to sending too much email. I'd love to hear it. I've got, it's a tough one. I was surprised actually, coming from a big company, several thousand people, and having, I was acting as a general manager in my last role, and so I had a fairly big team myself. I was expecting to deal with a lot less email, and I feel like that actually hasn't happened, which I've found somewhat interesting. But yeah, who knows? I need to read that book by the sounds of things.
I heard a great line the other day that complements the one thing. And it was, when you start your day by checking your email and starting to respond, you're living your day prioritized by other people. And I think it's really actually quite accurate. And I think what could be cool, and we see this, there's kind of one other real core customer profile for us, and that's the CEO with the rapidly growing startup. And whether that's remote sales teams, like I was kind of discussing earlier, or whatever that is, they want to replicate top performance from day one. So Finn is a part of the onboarding experience for most of our community. And if you can leverage that to make your team the best and prioritize their time based on who's doing best so far, you can create an efficiency process across the board that makes the team effective the whole time and not just fixing things, but also as you're scaling really fast. So I do think there's a bit of prioritization there. That would be nice if it told us all to open our inboxes less, or if there was some cool metric. Maybe we can make that happen, Evan. Maybe we can surface enough data to know that there's like a sweet spot in efficiency is if you only check your email twice a day and it's at dedicated times that's in your email signature or something. Who knows? We'll figure it out.
We as humans have been dragged into the twilight zone of email response only after the last, I suppose, generation. And I still think humans are learning to live with technology. And it's a real challenge. And I try and avoid opening my email until I'm at my desk, and sometimes just to make sure there's nothing really, dramatic that needs responding and needs priority. But the term you use, which is, I'll use another version of it, was responding to other people's email is basically you're just creating your priorities based upon someone's to-do list, not your to-do list. And I think that's the thing that's what I struggle with every day. And it's like, I'm not going to start answering the emails. I'm going to do what's, the one thing or the things that are important to me and the organization, not be just on someone's to-do list. So I think we as humans are still adapting to the technology age because it's still pretty early days, like seriously. Evan, I was going to ask you, is there a typical customer size as well, or industry that you mentioned a couple of industries that is a good customer fit for you guys? Not particularly. I think the size of like I was saying, we have a lot of adoption in this area of customer operations, which is sort of any team that's dealing with customers, whether it's back office or front office. That seems to be much more of a predictor of the value is sort of the size of those teams rather than the size of the company. I guess there is a correlation there in the sense that you can't have a very small company with an extremely large customer operations team, but sometimes you do see that, or something close to that. So that's we work with everyone from we have a customer that's I think one of the 3 or 4 largest companies in the world, but then we do also have a lot of startups in our base, including travel startups and psychology startups. People doing telemedicine and telemedicine for mental health purposes. So not particularly, and I think the platform that we're building is very intentionally horizontal. It's beneath the stories that we tell about customer operations and these types of teams. What we're really trying to do is build a general purpose platform for instrumenting, understanding, and optimizing, and even in some cases automating knowledge work, essentially. And so we're very focused on not diving too deep in sort of irreversible ways into any sort of vertical or use case. Okay. Now the other challenge for a lot of software as a service companies where they're charging a fee for their service, is the business or financial model, is it a monthly subscription model based upon seat numbers? Is that what it is? Okay. So essentially the membership model has 2 challenges. Number one, amongst many, but I'll list just 2. Number one,
I wish there was 2.
Yeah, I'm just going to say 2. Okay. Getting new customers, all right, that's a given for any company. Okay, so, but then the challenge, there's 2 challenges that I mention all the time when I talk to software as a service founders and CEOs, is onboarding. How do you make it simple for people to onboard? And then number 2, how do you retain your customers? In other words, reduce churn. So let's talk about onboarding first, because I think that's important to know how you see that for your organization, howfin.com.
Yeah, onboarding is a huge thing for me. I mean, at Twilio, I think when I left, we had something like 8 million customers or 8 million developers using the product. And so we obviously there had a model that was very self-service oriented, or at least self-service compatible. And I think that's incredibly important. It comes back to the community discussion, which we could rat hole into, I think, again, for a long time. It's just extremely important that I think that you can't be in the room all the time. And so customers need to be able to trial your product and experiment with it and make a decision to use you, whether you happen to be in the room or not. when they're making that decision. And to me, that's a huge part of community. And there's a huge amount of product design that goes into facilitating that aspect of community. We at the moment are pretty hands-on with our customers during the onboarding, although it is a relatively rapid. It's a relatively rapid process. It takes a couple of hours for us to onboard most customers, but we are still involved in that. And it's good. It's a good thing and a bad thing. It means we get to meet all of our customers and we get to understand their problems, but it doesn't scale to those millions of customers, right? So we are also investing fairly heavily in building the tools that allow people to onboard themselves. And one of the nice things about the technological approach that we've decided to take towards this particular problem is we are focused on things that happen inside a web browser. That does mean that there's a very standard way of talking about things and a very standard way of interacting with user interfaces and how humans use them. So it does lower the technical barrier versus some of the other practices that folks have followed historically in order to understand human-computer interaction, which gets very esoteric very quickly. But I guess all I would say is we understand the importance of it more than anyone. I think we're investing in it very heavily. And I think it's fairly standard at for an early stage SaaS company to go through that progression in one way or another. Some companies have to go the other way, which is they start totally self-service and then they have to figure out how to build a sales engineering team, a pre-sales team, a post-sales integration team. That's also I think in the cloud computing space a very common transition to have to make.
Mm-hmm. So. I suppose it's maybe too early days for you, but what are some of the ways you reduce churn? Because in the membership model for software is that, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this as well, is that people join because of they join a software or a membership value add site or software. They come for the content or the application, but then they stay for the community. And Savvy, you're helping them build a community. So, and then community is a very
music
important...
to my ears, Jeff. Just if you could just say that on every one of your podcasts, not only will my business scale, but people will actually understand the discipline and the value of community.
And you didn't
big love from New York City.
Well, you didn't write this for me. This is but they stay for the community, and this is where the loyalty and churn reduction comes in. Is this correct? Maybe Savvy, you can answer that.
This is 100% correct, and I think I can actually speak for Evan and Finn on this one. One of the key moves that Finn did in the early pre-pandemic times was they started hosting dinners and inviting our community to them, which is where a lot of our initial customers actually converted from. So we certainly believe in that, and we make our customers feel like they have friends in the team, and everyone has the way that our community speaks about. I'm going to give Alec a shout out, the lad who does customer solutions. The notion is always that we need to scale him or automate him or clone him or do a lot of different things, but we have a really good rapport with our customers. We're very candid when I'm doing these voice of customer events, and I know that especially now that the situation, at least in North America, where our current community base is, though that's obviously expanding globally, we'll be able to bring our community together both virtually and in person a bit more, because I think, frankly, and we're going to create a show around this a little bit, because I do think that there's so many best practices that can be learned from across these teams to help everyone work better. Nobody likes busy work. No one likes doing a task that's boring and that doesn't leverage their brain and give them a sense of purpose at work. And I think that our community, when they come together, can share these ideas, and that in and of itself will help us with churn. There's a real, we care about our customers, and I know that everybody says that, but we really try and set our customers up to get the most out of Finn and succeed and work with them to achieve that level of success. So I think that's one of our secret weapons.
I mean, all true. I tend to think about churn a little bit more through the product lens, which is build a really great product, and it's there's no real natural reason for churn. I think there's another dimension to it as well, which is how well suited are the customers to the product and the product to the customers in the first place. And so I think if you are being, overly aggressive at trying to fit a product to a customer and it was never a great fit in the first place, then you're probably opening yourself up for some churn. But it's a statistic that for us is extremely low, and I think a lot of that just comes from build a really good product that is going to continue to deliver value for the customer. Full stop, basically.
Yeah. Well, essentially, you've got to create a great product that makes it sticky, and then the race for any software company is there's two battles you're fighting. One is the battle for getting market share against your competitors, and the other one is the battle of building technology that allows you to actually evolve and keep evolving quickly enough so that you win the technology war and you win the customer market share war as well. And but what I've heard is two voices here. One is build a great product, that will stop churn. Build a community, that'll stop churn. Guess what? I reckon it sits in the middle. I think you've got to do both, and that way it makes it even stickier. That's my little insight from listening to you guys.
You also want to pick a good problem. I mean, sometimes with churn, like it could just come down to solving a problem that's very short-lived, or a problem that is somehow very timely to sort of current economic conditions or current technology trends. And if you're solving one of those problems, then I think it just behooves you to figure out, you have a bit more of a challenge, let's say, in figuring out how to continue delivering consistent incremental economic value, basically.
Yeah. I'm aware of both your time, both New York and San Francisco, but maybe just to wrap things up, from both of you, what would be some suggestions you would make, top tips for startups that they need to make sure they're covering? Maybe Savvy first and Evan to finish it up.
I love it. Oh man. So top tips: talk to your customers early and often, and think about community early and often. I appreciate the healthy tension that always exists between marketing, community, and product, just as you saw in this dialogue. But the reality is, if you build it and it's just sitting there, they won't come. You have to find ways to get it to them, and you need to understand what they were doing before they found you. So talking to your customers, so invaluable, and understand not just the good stuff, but the bad, and learn how to take constructive criticism and when to take it, because sometimes your loudest users are not actually examples of what your future community and customer is going to be like. Your early adopters are not always your customer at scale, and understanding how you differentiate that and build your product roadmap based on those dialogues, I think is so critical. And Evan brought this up, but I really want to emphasize this: solve needs. Don't just make another thing to make another thing. Don't iterate, actually innovate and understand pain points, because any buy decision, no matter if it's a personal B2C buy decision or an enterprise buy decision for a company of 25,000 employees, there's some sort of emotional trigger that says we need this, and this problem is going to be solved by this thing, and I trust that, and there's the social proof within that. And don't be hesitant with stuff like that. It's a tough journey. And also, just last tip, because I don't think we talk about this enough, and this has nothing to do with Finn or anything that we just talked about, give yourself a break on mental health. Running a business, scaling a business, everything that we do is incredibly hard. If you're listening to this, you're probably doing something very challenging that someone may or may not have done before, and you need to give yourself credit for that endeavor and take care of yourself, because the rest of this stuff, it just gets harder. And launching a product and scaling it is incredibly hard. And I see it across all the founders and executives like Evan in my portfolio. Is if you don't put your own oxygen mask on first, you can't go get new customers, you can't close bigger deals, and you can't hire the best team possible.
I think that's a final great tip from you, Savvy. We're holistic human beings, and we're doing some work and we're doing startups, but don't forget that you've got a soul, a heart and a mind and a body that needs to be nourished and looked after. And go out and do a bike ride, meditate, eat good food, and then you'll be able to do a better job in the business. I think that's a great top tip to leave us with. Thanks, Avi. Evan, any couple of top tips?
I think my sort of thoughts are pretty much very aligned. I think in terms of, I do think a common failure mode is self-validating ideas. So sort of talking to your customers, quote unquote, but what you're really doing is really just trying to validate that you're correct. And so you're really just sort of asking them loaded questions or interpreting things in such a way where it validates what you already believe. I think that's a very common failure mode for early stage B2B software companies. And so I think, it's figuring out how to actually listen to the problem rather than validate the solution. That's super important. And then I think there's like another thing which is more modern and along the same lines, which is it can be quite easy to get overwhelmed with, you go on LinkedIn, and LinkedIn has this feed model now, like all the other social networks, and it can become very overwhelming to sort of say, oh man, this is already being solved. There's so many people doing this. There's so many companies. There's so many startups. Everyone's doing great. It's kind of like Instagram, where it's like people go on there and it's like, oh, everyone's living a great life. I think it's a tendency to do the same thing, where it's like you go and look at all these companies and everyone's fundraising and everyone's doing this, and it's just very distracting. It's very I think unhealthy, and in the same way that it's kind of unhealthy in your personal life, I think it's probably unhealthy for the business. And the better thing to do is just focus on the very specific problem that you're solving, talk with your customers, understand their problems, and make sure that you're solving it in a way where they're going to trust you to solve it. And it'll just compound, it'll just grow over time, and you'll find more. And it's just very easy to get swept up in people call it like productivity porn or entrepreneurship porn or whatever it is, but it's like it's very easy to get swept up in this versus just sort of staying focused on what it is that you're actually delivering right now.
I think it's some very wise advice from both of you, and I'm looking forward to seeing the rise of fin.com and seeing you guys make a difference in the world. So thank you, Savi, and thank you, Evan, for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. I thought this was going to be a shorter call, but it's actually been we're pushed into an hour plus. But it's great to have a conversation from around the world, to learn from some very smart people. That's what I love about this, is that. And thank you very much for your time, both of you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff. Pleasure's all ours.